When Burkina Faso expelled a NATO delegation in August 2025, the world paused. Diplomats called it reckless. Economists called it suicidal. But in Ouagadougou, one word echoed louder than all the criticism: dignity. President Ibrahim Traoré had just done what no leader in the Sahel had dared to do in decades: reject a military aid agreement offered by NATO, one that came with invisible chains. The offer, wrapped in the language of security cooperation, promised weapons training and protection. Yet buried deep within the fine print was the price: access to Burkina Faso's uranium oil and rare earth deposits. In the western corridors of power, it was business as usual. In the Sahel, it was a quiet revolution. The shockwaves were immediate. Foreign advisors were recalled overnight. Investment projects were frozen. Western media framed the decision as a populist gamble. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, people celebrated. For them, it was not defiance, it was redemption. A moment when a young nation decided that sovereignty was worth more than aid. From a political perspective, the decision was both symbolic and strategic. It drew a line in the sand between dependency and determination. And from where I stand, it was not an act of rebellion, it was an act of redefinition. Because in the modern world, the true battlefield is not always on the ground. Sometimes it is in the contracts that define who owns it. What NATO offered Burkina Faso was not a partnership, it was a bargain dressed in diplomacy. The so-called Security Assistance Framework promised $480 million in military support training and stability operations across the Sahel. But the document that crossed Traoré's desk told a very different story. Clause 1 granted 30 years of priority access to Burkina Faso's uranium oil and rare earths, the very elements that fuel Europe's energy transition. Clause 2 authorized a training outpost near Ouagadougou, essentially giving NATO the right to operate a forward base under the guise of security assistance. Clause 3 restricted Burkina Faso to purchasing all defense equipment exclusively from NATO members, shutting the door on emerging partners like China or Russia. Clause 4 required full data and intelligence sharing, including geological maps and surveillance data of mining zones. And Clause 5, perhaps the most revealing, stated that any dispute would be arbitrated not in Ouagadougou, but in Brussels. When Traoré reached that section, he reportedly looked up and said, "So even our soil must report to them. Then we are not a nation." He closed the document, stood, and ended the meeting. Hours later, the NATO delegation was escorted to the airport. From my analysis, this was not a moment of emotional pride, it was a surgical act of sovereignty. Traoré understood what many African leaders have failed to see. Aid with conditions is not assistance, it is acquisition. Burkina Faso was not rejecting the West, it was rejecting ownership without consent. And in that decision, a new chapter began: Africa's refusal to be rented. When Ibrahim Traoré addressed his cabinet after the expulsion, he didn't speak about GDP trade or sanctions. He spoke about dignity. "We will not trade dignity for dollars," he said. "A nation that depends on others to defend its soil will never be free." That statement became the foundation of what observers now call the dignity doctrine, a new political philosophy emerging from the Sahel, built not on external aid but on internal strength. In Burkina Faso, this doctrine reshaped the national mindset. State television replayed his words across the country. Schools discussed them. Farmers and soldiers began to see their daily struggles as part of a larger battle, not against hunger or insurgency alone, but against the idea that Africa must forever be a client continent. For decades, the West conditioned Africa to believe that progress could only come through partnership. Traoré challenged that paradigm. He did not reject cooperation, he redefined it. From a political standpoint, it was a masterstroke, turning a diplomatic crisis into a moral rallying point. From a historical view, it echoed the spirit of Thomas Sankara, another Burkinabe, who once declared that he who feeds you controls you. My personal reflection: the dignity doctrine is not anti-Western, it is pro-African. It does not close doors, it closes loopholes. Because what Burkina Faso rejected was not assistance, it was dependency disguised as friendship. And that in today's world is the rarest kind of courage. The expulsion of the NATO delegation rippled far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Within 24 hours, Paris called it a dangerous precedent. Washington expressed deep concern over the erosion of cooperation. Meanwhile, Beijing and Moscow issued cautious but supportive statements calling it a sovereign choice. But the real aftershock was not diplomatic, it was psychological. Across Mali, Niger, Chad, and even Senegal, the question began to spread like wildfire. If Traoré can say no, why can't we? For the Sahel, long treated as a theater of Western security experiments, this was revolutionary. The young officers who once saw NATO as untouchable now saw an African leader drawing a red line not with weapons, but with willpower. Western analysts called it reckless nationalism. But on the ground something else was happening. Universities began hosting debates about resource sovereignty. Youth groups launched campaigns titled "Our Minerals, Our Future." Even religious leaders framed the moment as a moral awakening, the idea that God gave Africa its riches not to be leased, but to be guarded. From my perspective, this was the real victory. Not the expulsion itself, but the contagion of confidence it created. Burkina Faso had cracked the illusion of inevitability, the belief that Africa must always compromise to survive. For the first time in decades, the balance of fear shifted. Western powers worried about instability. But African citizens, they began to believe in possibility. Every revolution has its cost, and Traoré knew it. By rejecting NATO's proposal, Burkina Faso risked losing hundreds of millions in foreign aid and investment. Western donors froze development projects. Financial analysts predicted economic contraction. Critics in global media framed the move as a suicidal gamble for a fragile economy already battling inflation and insurgency. But here's the paradox: the gamble was precisely the point. Burkina Faso's new policy was not built on aid dependence. It was built on resource independence. The government launched an emergency initiative to nationalize strategic mining zones, prioritizing state-controlled extraction and regional partnerships over multinational contracts. Instead of exporting raw uranium and rare earths to Europe, Traoré announced the creation of local refining programs and joint ventures with African and Asian partners. The economic vision was simple, yet radical. Our soil will feed our budget, not someone else's. From my analysis, the short-term pain was inevitable, but the long-term gain could be transformative. Because this decision wasn't just economic, it was structural. It aimed to rewrite the economic DNA of post-colonial Africa, from supplier to producer, from recipient to negotiator. And within months, early signs emerged. Domestic agricultural output rose 14%, youth employment programs expanded, and gold-backed currency stabilization talks with the Alliance of Sahel states began. Was it risky? Absolutely. But in geopolitics, as in life, there are moments when survival is not enough. One must choose sovereignty over safety. That's the gamble Traoré took. The decision in Ouagadougou did not stay within its borders. Within weeks, the reverberations reached Bamako, Niamey, and even Conakry. Leaders across the Sahel began to reassess their alliances, asking an uncomfortable question: have our partnerships made us stronger or more dependent? In Mali, where anti-French sentiment was already high, the government initiated talks on revising all security agreements with Western states. In Niger, the military council froze several joint mining projects involving European contractors. And in Guinea, youth movements carried banners that read, "Burkina has spoken. Africa is listening." This was more than political theater, it was the birth of a continental consciousness. For decades, African nations had been divided, played against each other through loans, trade restrictions, and military assistance. Traoré's stand, though risky, gave language and legitimacy to a growing desire of pan-African sovereignty. From my perspective, what's happening is not isolationism, but recalibration. Africa is no longer begging for inclusion, it's demanding respectful negotiation. The West, long used to dictating the terms, now faces a bloc of nations willing to define their own. And the Alliance of Sahel states, AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, emerged as a prototype of that new order, a coalition not founded on ideology, but on shared resistance to external control. This was not the end of globalization for Africa, it was the beginning of sovereign globalization written in Africa's own voice. By the end of 2025, the dust had not settled, it had transformed. Burkina Faso, once viewed as a struggling state, was now seen as the moral center of a new African awakening. Traoré's defiance had turned from controversy into strategy, from isolation into influence. The young president outlined a roadmap for the next decade. 1. Not measured by GDP, but by sovereign capacity, building African-controlled refineries and satellite mapping systems for natural resources, creating an African defense industrial hub, and launching the Pan-African School of Governance and Sovereignty to train a generation of leaders who serve the land, not the lender. To many in the West, this still sounded like utopia. But for Africans watching from Dakar, Lagos, or Nairobi, it felt like prophecy. Traoré's speech at the AES summit captured it perfectly. Our liberation will not come from war. It will come from work, from the hands that till our soil, from the minds that teach our children, from the courage to say no when no is the truth. From my analysis, this marks the rise of a new strategic paradigm, one where Africa no longer defines itself through others' acceptance, but through its own terms of progress. Yes, the risks remain: economic retaliation, political sabotage, media, disinformation. But history shows every movement that reshapes the world begins with defiance. And in that sense, Ibrahim Traoré's decision was more than political. It was civilizational. Because one man's refusal in Ouagadougou became a continent's whisper, and that whisper is now turning into a roar for African sovereignty.